Wales goes into lockdown, announcing a short, sharp shock from Friday to act as a firebreak on COVID-19. People are told to stay at home, all non-essential retail will close, and pubs, bars and restaurants will be restricted to takeaway service.
We know that if we do not act now, it will continue to accelerate, and there is a very real risk that our NHS would be overwhelmed.
I'm glad it's coming sooner rather than later. Yes, it's going to take a temporary hit, but a temporary hit is better than losing your life.
We'll be getting the latest reaction live from Cardiff. Also this lunchtime, talks resume over the introduction of tougher COVID measures in Manchester as the city's mayor demands more financial support. A tightening of restrictions across Europe, many countries reintroducing rules eased after earlier lockdowns. Making a splash, the swimmers braving winter waters to help scientists in the battle against dementia.
And coming up on BBC News, more criticism of VAR, particularly after the Merseyside derby, which saw a goal controversially ruled out, and no punishment for Pickford's tackle on Van Dijk.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Welsh Government has announced it's introducing a short national lockdown. What they're calling a firebreak will begin at 6 o'clock on Friday evening and will run until the 9th of November. People in Wales will be asked to stay at home and all non-essential retail will close. Pubs, bars and restaurants will be restricted to takeaway service only, and households cannot mix in any location. The First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said the objective was to break the chain of infection. Our Wales correspondent Thomas Morgan has the details.
As autumn turns to winter, there's a sense of déjà vu in Wales today, as the prospect of another national lockdown becomes a reality.
We know that if we do not act now, it will continue to accelerate, and there is a very real risk that our NHS would be overwhelmed. Over the weekend, the Cabinet of the Welsh Government met to continue our discussions about a time-limited firebreak, a short, sharp shock to turn back the clock, slow down the virus and give us more time. We met again this morning, and we have now reached the difficult decision to introduce a 2-week firebreak starting at 6 p.m. on Friday this week.
So from 6 p.m. on Friday until Monday the 9th of November, the Welsh public have been told they must stay at home as much as possible. There'll be no mixing with any other households indoors or outdoors, and they can only go outside for exercise. Non-essential retail shops will close, as well as leisure facilities and gyms, as well as hospitality businesses, bars and restaurants, with the exception of takeaways. And there'll be a £300 million business support scheme with up to £5,000 available per business. Cardiff, as well as the majority of Wales, has been under local lockdown measures for some time, meaning that it's banned by law to leave or enter an area under these measures. But with virus cases continuing to rise across the country here, today's announcement wasn't unexpected and will have a wider impact on the Welsh public.
The idea of going back into lockdown is a bit worrying for me. Especially I'm diabetic, so I have to shield. So that's going to mean another few weeks or months inside. So
the first lockdown, people didn't really know what they were in for, but I think we all know what it means this time around. Just don't know how much more people can take with not being with their families.
I think it was always going to be coming anyway, and I'm glad it's coming sooner rather than later. Yes, it's going to take a temporary hit, but a temporary hit is better than losing your life.
The firebreaker is an idea the First Minister has been in favour of as an action to mitigate the spread for some time, following its suggestion by SAGE, the scientists that advised the governments across the UK a few weeks ago.
If you just have the circuit breaker and then you lift things, then all that will happen is that infections will rise again and you will yo-yo in and out of restrictions. So I think the really important question is not only to talk about the short-term restrictions, but how will you reset things? How will you make things different to keep the infections down?
Mark Drakeford has suggested there could be a new national set of rules following this firebreaker. But if this short lockdown fails to mitigate the spread of the virus, for how long could Wales be under stringent measures heading into winter?
And Thomas joins me now from Cardiff. What about schools, Thomas?
Well, that's been the main sticking point, really, for the discussions between the Cabinet here over the past weekend, really. What were they going to do on schools and childcare? The sticking point really was to do with high schools. I think there was already a decision in place, really, following the guidance that was made a couple of months ago when it came to the transmission with under 11s, that there was a reduced risk of transmission, so primaries will be reopening after the first week, which is of course actually half term here in Wales. Childcare will carry on as normal over the half term period, and special schools will also reopen. But after the first week, it'll only be year 7s and 8 that will be going back to high school. The rest of high school years will be carrying on with online learning before reopening at the end of this firebreaker period. Universities will continue as normal, but students will have to remain at home in their halls of residence or wherever they now reside. Now, there's been a mixed response from opposition parties. The Conservatives in Wales have said that the Welsh Labour government's decision is the wrong one. They should have persisted with local lockdown measures. Plaid Cymru supported the idea of a firebreaker here, but they are asking what will be the measures after we come out of this firebreaker, and it's something many people will be wondering, especially if the virus numbers don't go the way the Welsh Government predicts and expects them to go.
Thomas Morgan, thank you very much. No more money, no increase in restrictions. That's basically the message from the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, as talks resume over government proposals to put the city into the highest alert level. He wants the government to reintroduce the 80% furlough scheme used previously in the pandemic to support the low-paid affected by Tier 3 closures. The government accused him of putting people's lives at risk. Dan Johnson reports.
This is a city that's been on the edge for days now. People know new restrictions are coming, but they're still not clear exactly when or what they'll mean.
If they want to put us into Tier 3, they need to make sure that they provide the money, 8% furlough for the people and the businesses so they don't collapse.
For me, I think we should just keep it as it is at this current moment in time, get the economy back up and running. Absolute massive must for me, definitely.
You don't want to see extra restrictions?
No way, no.
I'm from Australia and yeah, they've had really tough restrictions. My family is still in lockdown over there, so and their cases are right down to 0 at the minute, so I think if we take a leaf out of their books, we'll definitely be the same.
Talks over the weekend were described as constructive, but there's still no agreement, and every day adds to the risk.
We've seen hospitals like Salford, for example, reaching almost 100% ICU capacity, over 70% ICU capacity in Manchester, in Bolton and in other hospitals within the region. That's a serious situation and it demands action this week, preferably today.
Local politicians know the seriousness of the situation, and one Greater Manchester MP, Yasmin Qureshi, announced on social media that she was admitted to hospital over the weekend after testing positive. Here's a business that may have to close under tighter restrictions. Soft play centres were shut down in Lancashire last week, but allowed to stay open in Liverpool.
My little boy is 2.5 and lockdown has been awful anyway, but being able, these places have obviously started to open. Here's brilliant because it's really clean, they're fabulous. But it's really for him, it's about the social interaction.
It's incredibly difficult for business anyway because we already have to operate at 50% capacity, which is 50% of our income. There's no additional help for that. And then they're talking about closing us down. Our staff are on low incomes and they want to give us 2/3 of their income rather than the furloughed 80%, which was already a struggle. We need more financial help.
Making the sums add up for workers who are out of a job has been the real sticking point so far. If a business like this has to close, then how much support will there be for the staff? That's what the politicians haven't been able to agree on yet.
This battle over tiers has got everyone talking. Mayor Andy Burnham says he doesn't relish a standoff with the government, but other city regions like Sheffield are also on the brink, watching how this plays out. Dan Johnson, BBC News, Manchester.
Our political correspondent Ian Watson is in Westminster. Is this all about money?
It's certainly partly about money, Simon. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, would say it's far more than that. It's about supporting people who would be hit by the toughest restrictions in England, and he wants to see greater support, greater financial support for those who'd be effectively losing perhaps up to a third of their wages. But in order to grease the wheels of a deal, certainly more money is being made available by the government. When an area or a local authority such as Liverpool City Region or Lancashire goes into these higher rate of restrictions, they get some money for bolstering track and trace, for example, helping the clinically vulnerable. But both Lancashire and Liverpool were given £30 million more for so-called business support, and significantly the government is saying that Greater Manchester would get no less generous terms on a per capita basis, per head of the population, which could mean that around £60–70 million might be available for Greater Manchester if they accept greater restrictions. But Andy Burnham's made it very clear that he will not roll over, in his words, at the first sign of a cheque. There's also discussions going on, as you heard, in South Yorkshire as well. They say that the government's pressing them for a rapid agreement, but they're not going to be bounced into agreeing to go into Tier 3 at this stage. And I think these difficult negotiations which the government have is partly a consequence of this local and regional approach which Boris Johnson has taken, and that means you have to get into lots and lots of protracted negotiations rather than having a full-scale nationwide lockdown such as Wales.
Ian, thank you very much. Schools in Northern Ireland are closed for 2 weeks from today as new restrictions there come into force. Meanwhile, in the south, the Irish government is set to tighten coronavirus restrictions, including shutting down most of the retail sector for several weeks. Ministers are meeting in Dublin this afternoon with an announcement expected this evening. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page has more.
Schools weren't meant to be still and silent this week, but half-term has come unexpectedly early. A-level students at the Belfast Model School for Girls didn't want an extended break.
The least time we have in school, I suppose, is a wee bit worrying, you know. We won't have face-to-face contact with our teachers for learning and things like that, which I know myself and a lot of my classmates really benefit from.
I'm quite worried for the exams that we have coming up, just because we won't be able to be in class with our teachers probably as much with the way things are going at the minute, and it's hard to learn online. I like to have things explained to me. It's just easier when you're face to face with a teacher.
Though pupils do say some good has come out of the turbulence of 2020.
It makes you grateful for the time you have whenever you are in school, and it makes you appreciate things more, and like time spent with your friends and actually being able to be in the environment of the classroom.
In my opinion, it's helped me a lot with my mental health and helped me get into it's just helped me to be more grateful for a lot of things and help me understand, to be more aware of some stuff.
If there's another school shut down, the online teaching is ready to go.
We have to be ready because we just don't know, as we found out just recently, that when we might have to close again. We just need to be there for the students, because the most important thing is promoting their well-being, their resilience, and indeed extending their learning in whatever capacity we can.
What have been the most difficult things about the last few months, and have there been positives?
I think the most challenging thing for us was ensuring that we had our environment that was welcoming for staff and students, but that was safe. Our students have had to develop more independence and resilience in their learning, and that's always going to be a life skill they can carry forward.
One of the ways in which education is different in Northern Ireland is that the vast majority of pupils in their last year of primary school sit a series of exam papers, the transfer test, to decide who gets into grammar school. The tests have been postponed for about 2 months. They're due to take place in January. But parents and teachers of the children going through that selection process are particularly worried about the impact of all the COVID disruption.
Certainly, if this break was to continue beyond 2 weeks, I think the pressures that would be brought to bear would be enormous to try to see, can we really have to make a change for this year, because it's just, it's proving to be impossible to provide those children with the level of education that they would require.
The pandemic pressures in schools include quarantined classes, self-isolating staff and broken routines. Teachers, pupils and families are hoping for a brighter picture when they return. Chris Page, BBC News, Belfast.
The government in Scotland has blamed a delay in releasing COVID test results over the weekend on a UK government-run testing lab in Glasgow. The UK government says this is categorically untrue. Well, our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, is in Glasgow for us now. So what has gone wrong here, Sarah?
Well, there's been a degree of confusion about exactly what's gone wrong and whose fault it is. But you can see that there's clearly a problem if you look at the numbers. So on Sunday, 316 positive tests were reported. Well, compare that with today, 993, over 1,000 on Saturday. So it does look as though that Sunday figure was artificially low. Nicola Sturgeon said that was due to a processing delay within the UK government lab system, and then the UK government responded by saying that was categorically untrue and that there was no problem with processing capacity at the Glasgow lab. What does seem to have happened is that over 600 tests were rerouted from Glasgow to other UK labs to be tested there, and the UK government say that is completely routine. Well, she was doing her daily briefing at lunchtime, Nicola Sturgeon, as she always does every weekday, and she said she didn't want to get into a war of words about this. She didn't want to have a spat. She wanted to be clear that the system is working, that people should have confidence in it, and that whilst there have been some intermittent problems and what she described as frustrations, the Scottish and the UK governments are working together to try and get everything up and running properly. She also gave us a glimpse of what might be coming later this week when she said they would announce their strategic framework, which will include 3 tiers, just like you have in operation in England.
Sarah, thank you very much, Sarah Smith. A range of new restrictions have been brought in across Europe. In Belgium, cafes and bars are closed for a month and a curfew's been imposed. Italy has tightened rules around hospitality, and in France, more than 60,000 new cases were confirmed over the weekend. Richard Galpin reports.
Here in Belgium, a few people ventured into restaurants yesterday evening for a final meal out before all restaurants, cafes and bars closed down for the next 4 weeks, with a curfew imposed from midnight until 5 a.m. The staff and the manager here are distraught.
We don't feel considered, and it hurts my heart. I'm so sorry, but I can't take it anymore.
The aim of this shutdown to stop the rapid rise in infections, which has already left more than 10,000 people dead in this country. It was Italy which was the hardest hit European country in the first wave of the virus. Now once again is facing a surge in new cases, almost 12,000 daily infections recorded at the weekend. This man in Milan saying cases had gone up from around 100 a day to more than 600 or 700, and the cold weather could make it even worse. So now new restrictions are coming in, including mayors getting powers to close public areas after 9 o'clock at night, and the opening times of bars and restaurants changing.
These measures will allow us to face this new wave of the virus that is hitting not just Italy but the whole of Europe. We cannot waste time. We have to act using all the possible measures to avoid a new total lockdown. The country cannot afford a new stop that would end up seriously harming our economy.
France, like Italy, is also facing record numbers of new cases. 9 major cities, including Paris, are already under a nighttime curfew for at least a month. People breaking this face fines. Such is the pressure on health systems in European countries now as winter approaches, that the military in the Czech Republic is being brought in to set up a field hospital in the capital, Prague. It's due to be up and running next week with a capacity of 500 beds. A stark sign of the battle ahead this winter in Europe. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
It's coming up to 1:20, our top story this lunchtime. Wales is to go into lockdown, announcing a short, sharp shock to act as a firebreak on COVID-19 from Friday. The Home Secretary says she will look into calls for a public inquiry into the Birmingham pub bombings.
Coming up on BBC News, Chris Froome's building up to his last race with Ineos Grenadiers as he aims to win his 3rd Vuelta a España. The Brits fully recovered after an horrific crash in France last year.
The leaders of the UK's Anglican churches have written a rare joint letter to warn that the government's new Brexit legislation could set a disastrous precedent. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York, as well as the heads of the Scottish Episcopal Church, the Church in Wales and the Church of Ireland, said the Internal Markets Bill could profoundly affect the future of their countries. It comes as the government's Brexit trade negotiator, Lord Frost, continues talks on the phone today after Michel Barnier cancelled plans to travel to London. But as our reality check correspondent Chris Morris now explains, deal or no deal, major changes are coming to the UK's relationship. Chris.
Simon, thanks. Yeah, as the rhetoric heats up, it's worth remembering that a trade deal is still possible, but also that any deal that might emerge in the next few weeks isn't going to produce the frictionless trade that we have now. Once the UK leaves the EU single market and the customs union, there will be big changes at British borders with the EU come what may. Among other things, deal or no deal, businesses that trade with the EU are going to have to fill in import and export declarations. There will also be substantial checks taking place at the border on the trade in food, plants and animals. The UK says it will phase in some of this new border bureaucracy over 6 months, but the EU isn't doing that. Don't forget, roughly 10,000 lorries pass through Dover every day, with about 6,000 more using the Channel Tunnel. Any big delay could lead to gridlock. So the government has made plans to divert freight to other ports around the country just in case. The UK will, in the government's words, take back control of its borders by implementing a new immigration policy, ending free movement to and from the EU. But that will come at an economic cost for companies that trade with Europe. And there will be very little in a deal done now that will help the UK's substantial trade in services with the EU. So, given that any deal finalised in the next few weeks would be pretty thin, some Brexit supporters argue that it's not worth compromising on anything important to get it done. Better to leave with no deal, they argue, and get on with it. But a majority of businesses think that would be a disaster. More than 3/4 of 648 companies surveyed last month by the Confederation of British Industries say a deal is essential. Business groups in Germany, France and Italy have said much the same thing. And there are still several reasons why a basic deal would make sense for both sides. It would make sure tariffs or taxes are not suddenly imposed on the trade in goods. For the car industry, for example, that's absolutely critical. A trade deal would make it much more likely that the EU would recognise UK data and financial services rules, and both will be really important in the future. Finally, a deal would be a good basis for further talks, which will be necessary, a platform on which both sides can build. No deal, on the other hand, could lead, at least in the short term, to a period of bitter recrimination. Now, the government says it's ready for that, but with every country in Europe consumed by the COVID crisis, it could be an extra headache they could all do without. To get a deal done, though, everyone involved still needs to compromise. Simon.
Chris, thank you very much. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has agreed to look into calls for a public inquiry into the Birmingham pub bombings which killed 21 people in 1974. Last year, an inquest jury found the victims were unlawfully killed, but didn't establish who was responsible. Our Midlands correspondent Phil Mackey reports.
It's 46 years since bombs were set off in 2 busy pubs in Birmingham city centre. The carnage caused at the Mulberry Bush and the Tavern in the Town left 21 dead and more than 200 others hurt, many with life-changing injuries. Nearly 5 decades later, it's not known exactly who was to blame. Announcing that she would consider a public inquiry, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, said, "I recognise the desire of the victims' families and the wider community to see those responsible brought to justice, so I would welcome the opportunity to meet some of the families."
Stop and read and what it says. And
at one of 2 memorials to the attacks, not far from where her sister Maxine died, Julie Hambleton welcomed the news.
It will open the door to a level of information that could provide a catalyst to maybe then give our loved ones what they deserve, to help them to maybe rest in peace, which is truth, justice and accountability.
6 men who were jailed for the attacks later had their convictions quashed. Although an inquest last year revealed the names of an IRA cell believed to have been responsible, there's little hope for a criminal prosecution.
For the families and their supporters, this is a real breakthrough. They think that momentum is with them now and they will finally get those answers that they've been waiting for such a long time.
This does remain the single biggest unsolved crime in recent British history. 46 years ago, but there are still families and friends of the victims who have not received justice. And what this potential inquiry gives is the prospect of at last that justice being done.
Here they are, our heroes.
Just last week, these supporters arrived in Westminster after walking from Birmingham to raise money for the campaign.
What an absolute legend, look.
The families are desperate to keep the case in the public eye so their loved ones are not forgotten. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Birmingham.
French police have raided the homes of dozens of suspected Islamic radicals following the killing of a teacher who showed controversial cartoons of Prophet Muhammad to his pupils. Over the weekend, vigils were held in memory of teacher Samuel Paty. Some of those being questioned today are believed to have posted messages of support for the killer who was shot dead by police after the attack. The Navy says it's launched an investigation after reports that an officer turned up unfit for duty for work on board a nuclear submarine. Let's get more from our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. Jonathan, what's gone on here?
Well, what's gone on shouldn't have gone on at all. This is, remember, a nuclear submarine armed with Trident nuclear-armed missiles. Now, this particular officer was the duty weapons engineer. He'd been on shore. Suspicion was he'd been drinking. He came on duty for his watch, and then the crew smelt the signs of alcohol consumption, raised the alert, and he was immediately removed from command, from his role being in charge of those nuclear weapons, and sent home. Now, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has been here on Salisbury Plain talking to British soldiers. He said he would raise this matter with the First Sea Lord, but he also made clear there were checks and balances on these nuclear submarines, and in this case it worked. As soon as the suspicions were raised, that particular officer was removed from command. It isn't the only thing that's gone wrong on this trip. It's been in Kings Bay, in Georgia, in the US, where they load up those Trident missiles. There have been, since that incident occurred about a month ago, an outbreak of COVID among the crew, with suggestions, reports in some newspapers that they have broken the COVID restrictions and visited bars. And remember, 3 years ago, this same submarine, HMS Vigilant, was in another scandal where some of the crew were seen to have taken Class A drugs, and the captain was removed for having a relationship with a female member of the crew. So this is not being great for the Royal Navy. It shouldn't happen on a nuclear-armed submarine. It is embarrassing, but the checks did work.
Jonathan Beale, thank you very much. Scientists trying to find a cure for dementia have made a promising discovery in a group of cold water swimmers at a Lido in London. The researchers from Cambridge University found the swimmers produced a protein associated with hibernation, which could delay the disease. Our correspondent Justin Rolat explains.
Here beside my favourite pool, Parliament Hill Lido in London, Lido, it depends how you want to go. But the link, bizarrely, between cold water and dementia is hibernation, and a latent hibernation ability that all human beings appear to retain. Now, I discovered this because I swim here. I was talking to other swimmers and they said there's this doctor who's coming down and she's taking bloods from us and testing for some protein that may be associated with dementia. I was really curious about this, and back in February, before the COVID restrictions, we made this film. The idea of going for a swim on a cold winter morning like this may not seem very appealing, especially when you know that the water temperature is just 7 degrees centigrade. But here goes. It certainly is refreshing. Your whole body kind of screams in shock. But if you just stay here for a few seconds, you do begin to get used to it, and then you can begin to get some lengths in.
And it now seems a chilly dip may offer more than just an exhilarating thrill.
Scientists have discovered that being very cold can actually protect your brain.
6 years ago, BBC Radio reported a study that showed that cold mice develop more of a protein associated with hibernation. The study found the protein can protect against and even repair the damage dementia does. The obvious next step was to see if humans develop the protein too. Look, which is where this place, Hampstead Heath at Lido, comes in.
Well, we're from the north, so we can handle it.
One Lido swimmer heard the radio interview.
I just had the idea that we have a cohort of people here that regularly get cold, and can we translate that through to that kind of environment?
So we don't know.
Dozens of volunteers agreed to be tested by the scientist leading the study.
We compared you to a bunch of people doing Tai Chi who didn't get cold, and
None of them get increased levels of this protein, but many of you did.
She's here to give them the results.
You are the first sort of non-patient cohort to show that cold water swimming raises this protective protein, which is pretty cool.
Professor Malucci is now trying to find a drug that stimulates the production of the protein in humans and to see if it really does help delay dementia.
If you slowed the progress of dementia by even a couple of years on a whole population, that would have an enormous impact economically and health-wise.
These cold proteins are a very promising line of research, but she warns it is still early days. Sadly, there are no guarantees that this will lead to a successful dementia treatment. Justin Rolat, BBC News, London.
Lots of you tweeting about the pronunciation of Lido in London. I'm sticking to London. Let's get the weather. Here's Stav.
Thanks very much, Simon. Good afternoon to you. Well, it was chilly but largely dry last week thanks to high pressure. Gave us a chance to get out and about and enjoy the autumn colours. But things are taking a change through this week. Areas of low pressure moving up from the southwest off the Atlantic is going to turn a lot more unsettled than it was last week. Some wet and windy weather at times, particularly in the north and the west, certainly today. But it will be turning milder. That's because we've got winds coming up from the south, drawing this air from Iberia. And you can see why these areas of low pressure, lots of isobars on the charts to start the new week, and lots of weather fronts too, bringing some very wet weather for parts of Northern Ireland and into Scotland. We have yellow warnings in force for this region. It's been very wet here over the last few hours. Further south and east, you'll notice some high cloud around, but also some holes in that cloud to allow for some sunshine. So quite a contrast from northwest to southeast. A breezy day to come for all areas, especially around the Irish Sea, where we could see even near gale force winds, but very wet for Northern Ireland, particularly western Scotland around Argyll into Dumfries and Galloway. Rainfall totals really starting to tot up here as we move through the day and into overnight. One thing you will notice, though, a little bit milder than it's been of late. Those temperatures around the mid-teens Celsius for many of us. Now, tonight it stays quite breezy, stays very wet Northern Ireland and Scotland. The rain does become more confined towards Scotland, again very wet for the west of Scotland through the night. Another band of rain spreads across Wales and England, a bit of a clearance behind it for Northern Ireland, Wales, the West Midlands and into the southwest, and quite a mild night to come for most. That rain eventually clears away from the eastern side of England pretty quickly through tomorrow morning. Then it's brighter, some sunshine around, but also some showers. A new cluster of showers running up the Irish Sea will bring some very heavy rain here, some merging together to produce longer spells of rain, maybe some rumbles of thunder. Stays wet and windy for the far north of Scotland, but the further east you are tending to stay dry and very mild, 17 or 18 degrees, but mild pretty much across the board away from the Northern Isles. Into Wednesday, new area of low pressure coming up from Iberia. This is giving us a little bit of a headache with its position. It could be a little bit further northwards and westwards. But one thing we're pretty sure on is that it's going to bring a spell of heavy rain for England and Wales, and perhaps a spell of very strong winds across the southeast. This is certainly one to watch. Further north and west, it could be brighter with sunshine showers, still wet and windy and quite cool for the far north of Scotland. Northerly winds here, which will be strong at times. But again, the mid to high teens Celsius for central and southern areas. Brief transient ridge of high pressure will bring settled weather to many of us for Thursday. It starts to turn wetter and windier again across the west on Friday. Simon.
Stav, thank you very much for that. A reminder of our top story. Wales is to go into lockdown, announcing a short, sharp shock to act as a firebreak on COVID-19. That's all from the BBC News at 1. On BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are. From me, good afternoon.